Good morning, sixth graders. It's Mrs. Reid, and I'm going to try to use technology to be with you even when I'm not in the classroom. Thank you for being on your best behavior with our guest teacher, Mrs. Evans, today. I know you'll have a great day, and please be courteous and considerate to others. Anyone who didn't do your Genius Hour showcase on Friday, remember you will be doing them first thing tomorrow for me, so make sure that you come in ready to go with your Genius Hour showcase. We're going to begin today with a Schoolhouse Rock, the shot heard round the world. And this is to get you thinking about what was happening. Really make sure you watch and listen for the real history, beyond the cute cartoon that is Schoolhouse Rock and Knowledge is Power. Listen for the history of the American Revolutionary War.
The British are coming! The British are coming! Now the ride of Paul Revere set the nation on its ear, and the shot at Lexington heard round the world. When the British fired in the early dawn, the War of Independence had begun. The die was cast, the rebel flag unfurled, and on to Concord marched the foe to seize the arsenal. There you know, waking folks, searching all around, till our militia stopped them in their tracks. At the old North Bridge we turned them back and chased those redcoats back to Boston town. And the shot heard around the world was the start of the revolution. The Minutemen were ready on the move. Take your powder, take your gun, report to General Washington. Hurry in, there's not an hour to lose. Now at famous Bunker Hill, even though we lost, it was quite a thrill. The rebel Colonel Prescott proved he was wise, outnumbered and low on ammunition. As the British stormed his position, he said, hold your fire till you see the whites of their eyes. Though the next few years were rough, General Washington's men proved they were tough. Those hungry, ragged boys would not be beat. One night they crossed the Delaware, surprised the Hessians in their lair, and at Valley Forge they just bundled up their feet. Now the shot heard round the world was the start of the revolution. The men were ready on the move. Take your blanket, take your son, report to General Washington. We got our rights and now it's time to prove. Well, they showed such determination that they won the admiration of countries across the sea like France and Spain, who loaned the colony ships and guns and put the British on the run, and the Continental Army on its feet again. And though they lost some battles too, the Americans swore they see it through. Their raiding parties shipped up, hit and run. At Yorktown, the British could not retreat, modeled up by Washington and the French fleet. Cornwallis surrendered, and finally we had won. Hooray! Our shot heard round the world to the end of the revolution. The Continental rabble took the day, and the father of our country beat the British there at Yorktown, brought freedom to you and me and the USA. God bless America, let freedom ring.
So a lot of the history there with the battles that they had, including Valley Forge and George Washington crossing the Delaware, but also talking about how France and Spain helped the colonists. They wouldn't have made it through the Revolutionary War without assistance, but it wasn't because France and Spain really liked the colonists or the Minutemen that were the colonists. It was that they disliked the British that much that they would help the colonists. So a lot of the history in there. And that's where we're going to pick up and talk a little bit about Canada in the 1700s today. Go ahead and from your two-pocket social studies folder, take out your two-column timeline, the 1600s and 1700s. Also take out your Canada history handout. We'll be looking at the back side that you read the other day on Thursday with Mrs. Kelso, the sub that was in class also. Make sure that you have this timeline copied down. If not, you need to get it from a friend. This PowerPoint is also on my website, on my Google site. So take a minute, and once you have that out in front of you, turn with a table partner, the person sitting next to you at your little table, and share with them what you remember about the 1700s. And the video can be paused for a minute while you guys turn and talk. Hopefully you talked a little bit about those Acadians and the French and Indian War, that the British won all of the land, that you remembered, and then it led up to them getting so angry by all the taxes without representation that they fight in 1775, the American Revolutionary War. Taking a look at Canada's side through the 1800s, when you read on the back side of that handout and you look at how they talk about the American Revolution, it's not a revolution. The colonists were called rebels, and in Great Britain today, even in the textbooks, it's called the Colonist Rebellion against the British throne. So it was not a revolution as it was seen by the British, it was seen as a rebellion. On the back side, and then also reading pages 184 and 180 through 187 that you read last week, if you haven't read those pages, make sure that you use the textbook and read those pages. Looking at Canada in the 1700s, three important events that we have on our timeline that we need to understand why they happened and how they relate to the United States. And there's a lot of connections between, because the Loyalists leave the United States after, and so all of these people that didn't want to break free from Great Britain go to the Canada colony to be Loyalist in Ontario, and the Ontario area's population rises rapidly as the Loyalists, over 40,000, arrive, and that's on the back of that the Canada history handout. In 1754 to 1763, the French and Indian War, and after the French and Indian War, the British control all these French in Quebec, and the French and English still do not like each other. They've been fighting for years. They just ended a 7-year war against each other. And so what the British government, they have to try to make peace. And so what they're going to pass, and this was one of the pages in your textbook on conflict and compromise, the Quebec Act of 1774, passed by the British King, they gain Quebec after the French and Indian War. It allows the French people, instead of forcing them to start learning English, which they despise, and to change their religion like the King of England had done, it gives them the rights of the French to preserve their culture, to keep speaking their language and keep practicing their French Catholic religion. So it was trying to stop the French from rebelling as the colonists had in the United States. They didn't want to lose Canada too. The king knows he's still going to gain a lot from the fur trade in Canada. He doesn't want to lose Canada, the British king. And because of that Quebec Act and the French and English settlement in Canada, this history, this conflict between the French and English, Canada today even is a bilingual nation. All students in Canada learn from elementary school both French and English, and they need to be able to speak fluently French and English. I remember when we traveled to Quebec, they could tell who was Canadian and British Canadian, and they would try to make them speak the French because they wanted them to practice. A lot of times the Canadians learn it in school, and if they don't use it, then they don't remember how to speak the French. But when they travel to Quebec, everything, the restaurants, when you order your food, everything is in French. And all the schools in Quebec are in French as well still. And that was because of that Quebec Act and allowing the French to preserve their culture. So Canada is officially a bilingual, which means speaking fluently 2 languages, a bilingual nation with French and English, because those were the 2 groups in conflict and the 2 groups that settled. Using just your pencil, we're not going to take time to get out highlighters because we're going to just use a small paragraph. Looking at the back of the Canada history handout, find the paragraph for 1791. And after the Quebec Act, something else that Great Britain does to try to keep peace in its colony, allowing the French to preserve their culture, they're going to divide it into 2 regions. And the Upper Canada, which is really south, it's Ontario and it's further south, so you think it would be lower, but of course it's British, and they're going to call it upper, like upper class citizens. And the lower part, which is actually further north, Quebec, they're going to call lower French, though is the French part, lower Canada. And again, this is a British colony. At this time is when they start to call it Canada, the Canadian colony, and they have Upper Canada and Lower Canada, so they divide them. And it was to try to keep peace, but it actually increases the tension between the French and English. There's going to be a lot of prejudice, and the French know that they're treating them as lower class citizens. There's a lot of discrimination. They won't hire them for jobs. They pay them lower wages. So if you would underline what's on that screen, and if you need to pause the video, go ahead. I'm going to go on to the next slide that shows us a little bit more about this division and what it did to Canada. So this conflict, this tension from dividing Canada in 1791, well, way back from the French and Indian War, still exists in Canada today. Quebec has had votes recently whether they should become an independent country, separate from Canada, withdraw, kind of like the South wanted to do in the Civil War with us, that we'll talk about in a little bit as we go through the 1800s. So the king is trying to keep Canada united, but it divides it in these two parts to try to keep that peace between the two cultures. So as you look at upper and lower Canada, upper is the British, it's Ontario, but it's actually south. They are treated better, get paid more for jobs, and English is definitely the preferred language and culture. And that's because so many loyalists from the colonies moved there, so the British way outnumber the French now, because more and more British settlers have come after Great Britain wins the land, all of the land, from the French and Indian War. So the new British from the American colonies after the Revolution are the loyalists, and the lower is the Quebec part where the French want to preserve their French culture, language, and religion. And they face prejudice, lower paying jobs, maybe not being hired because they speak French. It was real obvious. Now we're going to look at moving into the 1800s, the relationship between the British colony of Canada and the U.S. What kind of relationship did they have in the early 1800s? There's still a lot of tension. The Loyalists are really furious at this new nation, the United States, that they had to leave their homes and go to Ontario, to Canada. And how was Canada's road to independence different than the United States? The Canada has all of these loyalists. It's still a British colony, and they don't want to separate from Great Britain. When will Canada become independent of Great Britain? What will make these loyalists want to separate from Great Britain and be, because we know Canada today is an independent country. Today we're going to focus on the United States and the new nation as we look at the 1800s, and then we will compare it with Canada. But we'll go through the U.S. to kind of help you organize the events and what happened, and how we're going to think about how does this new nation, the United States, these colonies that just became a new country, a baby really, become a world power. What do you think it took for the U.S. to become so powerful? This slide is an overview of the U.S. and the significant and important events for the U.S. during the 1800s. First is westward expansion, beginning with the Lewis and Clark expedition. This is what we're going to focus on today, but you can see it's going to lead to our country as we expand west. We have to do something with the Indians, and the English, the British's approach, and the United States is going to adopt that, is to remove Indian removal, and then leading to the Civil War and the Industrial Revolution. Lewis and Clark began on their boat in St. Louis, where the Missouri River meets the Mississippi River. This was after Thomas Jefferson purchased the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon at the beginning of the 1800s in 1803, President Thomas Jefferson. And so they will go west by sailing up against the current, the Missouri River, trying to find the Northwest Passage all the way to the Pacific Ocean. What landform is in the west again? I know we talked about this. This is a picture from our family trip out west. This is one of the roads that terrified me, scared me to death as my husband was driving around these corners, because it looks like you can slide right down the side. But there are roads, at least, on the edge of this mountain. This is in Yellowstone, but they had to cross, Lewis and Clark have to cross Rocky Mountains like this, and how are they going to get across? And there were no roads. They're on horseback at the point that they meet the mountains. They have to leave their boats and take off and portage across the mountains and survive, and winter's going to hit. So you're going to watch a short film on Lewis and Clark, and then during that movie, I would like you to make sure you pause the movie, get scrap paper for everybody, a white piece of scrap paper, have one person per row go up to get scrap paper from the black shelves, and as you watch the movie, you're going to list 3 significant results. You don't have to take notes the whole time. I want you to watch the movie and see the images, but try to write down what you think are the 3 most significant results, things that happened because of their expedition.